Hello everybody and welcome back to RS Trains. My name is Corey and in today's video we'll be covering a topic that I've been wanting to do for a little while now, and I've been seeing it spread all around the O-Gauge railroading community here on YouTube, and that is my thoughts on Fastrack, Lionel's Fastrack system. Because as you can see, my entire O-scale layout here is made of Lionel's Fastrack. And I've seen in some people's videos, some people will be like, you know, I like Fastrack and X, Y, Z, and other people will be like, oh, I hate it. So I thought people might be interested in hearing my opinion, of course, because again, the whole layout is built of Fastrack, and I have a few things, both pros and cons, I'd like to talk about today. So we're going to be dividing today's video into three little parts. We're going to be doing how I got started with Fastrack, the pros and cons I've personally experienced with Fastrack, and then part 3 is what do I recommend to you, the viewer. And of course part 3 depends on where you are as a model railroader, of course, but either way though, it'll be a fun video today. So if you like it, make sure to smash that like button down below, and if you're new to my YouTube channel, please make sure to hit that red subscribe button down below as well, so you don't miss out on my many future O-scale and HO-scale model train videos. But yeah, without further ado, let's roll. So how did I get started with Fastrack? Well, it's an interesting story that kind of just ties along with my whole experience in the world of O-Gauge trains as well. Well, I believe it was probably 2005, I'm pretty sure, was when I got my very first loop of Fastrack. How it works was I was a very little kid. I was probably 3, I believe, either 3 or 4, and little Corey was absolutely starting to love trains, and especially Lionel trains at that. My grandfather had his big Lionel train layout at his home, but he used O-Gauge track, and he didn't really have any leftover track for me to have. So at some point, I guess before Christmas, Mom and Dad bought me a loop of Fastrack to have around under the tree, and that did the job. I mean, I loved it. It was so much fun to watch the trains go around. It was a really nice looking system. I thought it looked wonderful. I really liked the shiny silver rails, of course, and all the multitude of many ties, and I liked the ballasty roadbed too, and the fact that everything was super smooth. I mean, on these things it's not rough at all. It doesn't get kind of dirty, or at least in my case, as long as you clean it, of course, but it didn't get dirty like tubular track, and everything fit together really nicely and snug, and you didn't have any gaps in between the tracks. So my trains would run really smooth, and since I didn't have any issues with it, as I would grow up and desire a bigger model train layout, I got more and more Fastrack, and I really wouldn't have the pros and cons that I'll be mentioning in today's video until after I built the layout here, and when I really started getting a more intricate track plan than just 2 ovals or what have you, or an oval with the siding, of course. But growing up, I thought it was fine. I never had any issues with it, but that's because I really didn't go for anything complex. I just had, at most, that would be like a loop or 2 loops or maybe 3 loops. It's depending on what Corey you ask, from what time period. But yeah, I never had any issues with it, and I liked it a lot. So I think that kind of gets us to where we are today. Since I never had any issues, I just got more and more Fastrack. So we'll enter part 2. Alright, pros and cons. Well, this is probably going to be the longest section of today's train video, so I apologize in advance. But we have many pros to talk about and a few cons, of course. But starting off with pro number 1 about Fastrack, I think Fastrack looks great. I mean, you've got those really good looking silver rails, of course, and I like that they're not rounded like tubular track, because I found with real rails is that they kind of have a squarish top, of course. It wouldn't be too good if you saw a rounded rail in mainline service. That means it's been pretty worn and probably shouldn't be there, but I really like the silver rails, of course. I love the multitude of ties, and that when you look closely on a Fastrack piece, the ties actually have like wood grain detail on it, and that's just such a cool little thing you often miss. And then I really like the road bed on Fastrack, that ballasted road bed. I think it looks great, and when you're starting to lay out for the first time or just have it on the floor, it kind of gives you enough detail in your brain to imagine what it'd look like as a full complete layout and all. I think those three simple details go so far when you're building a train layout. So I think the looks of Fastrack are great. Functionality wise, it's fine. I've never, again, even with this big layout here, I've never really had many issues with the curved pieces and the straight pieces, of course. The switches is something I'll talk about in the cons section, but if you're just doing loops of track, needless how big they are, could be small, could be super large, it's fine. And I really love, and this goes into Fastrack pieces in general, I love how they're so snug and they always fit together super well. There's never any large gaps in the track, like, you know, like tubular track where sometimes it might not fit together all well. And I just love how the pieces can really stick and snap together well, and where it won't come apart. Like things in the past I've had issues with is tubular track, is when I would have a unscrewed together loop of track, whether it be on a table or on the floor, I would often find is that the more I ran around trains, especially heavy post-war ones, is that on the curves, or even on straight sections too, is that the more that train would go on that curve and kind of build stress or whatever into the curve, is that the curves would always come apart. Like the tracks would just kind of disconnect, and it would always happen whenever there's a train on top of it. So not only would I have to clean up a nasty post-war train derailment, but I'd also have to piece together back my train loop, and that was never much fun, and that's nothing anybody wants to deal with. So what I always love about Fastrack and similar types of track systems where the pieces snap together and they won't come apart easy, you got to put a little bit of muscle into it. So that's what I really like. Looks great, functions fine, and I think it sticks together really well, and that's such an important part about having either a temporary layout or a floor layout or whatever that might be, is that there aren't gaps. Because as us O-gauge guys know, there could be like the littlest gap ever and the whole train will come apart or what have you, especially if it's not screwed down. Like it'll derail over that really tiny little gap, and it's so stupid. But yeah, I think those are my pros about Fastrack. And then my other pro would be, at least from the switch perspective, which I'll transition to the cons in just a minute, but the switches are super smooth. I've played around with the old post-war Lionel switches, and I often found that they'd be kind of rough, where the train would be thrown into the curve and then thrown back over to the siding or the main line or whatever that might be. But what I've always liked about Fastrack switches is that, for the most part, my trains, especially if they're going slow, like to go nice and smooth over it. There's no loud click-clacks or any of that stuff, and any of that type of slamming the train around things. But now we unfortunately enter the cons, and the biggest cons I'll be talking about today, or the strongest con on my list, is going to be the Fastrack switches. I've had several issues with my Fastrack switches on the layout here, and that's what sucks, because the switch is like the pinnacle of model train layouts. It really is. That's how you expand your layout. Sure, you can have a lot of different loops and stuff like that, but being able to add diverging tracks and sidings and stub tracks to where then you can add accessories or whatever, the switch is such an important part, and it's such a fun part about the model train layout. But my switches, unfortunately, I've had several issues with. Some of those issues being, number one, switches are kind of picky as to what trains can and can't operate over them. For example, a lot of issues I'd have was with either my pre-war or post-war trains running over the switches. What would happen is that on some of the older models, some of the wheels, the flanges on the wheels would be so excessively large, so to say, unlike today's modern trains, is that when they would go over this kind of, I don't quite know what to describe it, but go over the certain part in the switch, which I can show you here, where it kind of comes up off the ground a little bit, it would throw the train up, kind of, because the flange would be hitting the bottom of the track, and then it'd throw it back down, so it kind of bump, and it'd almost scare you, because you'd look at it and you'd think your train's about to go off the track. Or again, I've had the issues with shoes too, the little shoes that would be underneath post-war either tenders or maybe rolling stock, of course, like passenger cars, freight cars, or at least the ones that operate with the knuckle couplers and all, I found that a lot of those like to get caught in the switches. I don't know quite where, but that'll derail your whole train. And I actually have on clip here a clip of my post-war 2025 going around the track, and the Fastrack switch tore my poor early tin plate post-war passenger car's shoe right off. So be very careful if you're going to have Fastrack switches and run pre-war things or post-war trains. And I've also found an issue to be with modern trains too. Modern locomotives like this MTH DNH RS11 over there, I found that with some of the switches on my layout, what'll happen is the points, the very tips of the switch, you know, the tracks that move, sometimes they won't go back all the way. And that inner rail will kind of stick out ever so slightly. And that with modern trains, as we know, more scale proportions, and same for the flanges on the wheels, are a lot more realistic and a lot more thinner. Lot less thick than the big post-war trains, but I found that those thin flanges can be enough to pick the switch. And the last thing you want derailing is your really nice prototypical scale model. Like, you know, some of these things can cost like $500 or $2,000. You don't want those trains to derail. So I believe on my layout in total I have 16 switches, and at least 2 to 3 of those switches, the flanges won't go back all the way. Now granted, I know there are ways to fix this, of course. I've seen it on the Lionel Trains Facebook page, of course, and I'm sure it's all over the OGR forum, but switches shouldn't really have this problem to begin with, I think. And I don't know what it's like from other manufacturers. I don't know what MTH Real Tracks switches might be like, or Atlas O-scale switches, or Ross custom switches and that stuff. I don't know if they might have the same problems and all that, but at least with Fastrack, I know the points shouldn't be doing that. And another issue I've had with Fastrack, and this one is actually pretty widespread throughout the layout, unfortunately, is that the remotes, the little way you actually flip your switch, the points back and forth, I have so many dull remotes. Now, granted, a lot of my switches might be from the early 2000s or maybe the mid to late 2010s, depending if it's like old new stock and all, but a lot of the remotes should work fine. And granted, I mean, you know, some of these switches are probably going on 10, 20 years maybe, but a lot of the switches don't really work anymore. They might light up fine, but I will go to flip the points on the track with the remote and nothing. Or maybe it might work going one way, but it might not work going the other way. And I think I have, like, again, 6 out of 16, or maybe 6 or 7 out of 16 switches on the entire train layout here that have that issue. So on top of pre-war and post-war trains not wanting to really go over well, or scale trains like this, and not the scale trains, the brand, but prototypical scale trains like this one here, I often found a lot of those like to pick it. And then again, wiring might not work well. Sometimes with the remotes, the points don't want to work that well, but don't let this discourage you. Of course, this is not every switch ever. Remember, majority of the switches technically on a layout don't have that issue, but I do know of a few other fellow O-scale model railroaders who have had issues like that in the past with Fastrack, where the switch was really the problem, where the rest of the track would be fine, but the switches that kind of act against them, so to say, or at least other kind of very tight clearance parts of track, whether that be crossovers or switches and stuff, or diamonds and stuff like that. But the switches are my biggest con. I don't really like that much against Fastrack. And a few other cons, I think. This now comes from a more mature Corey, so to say. What I didn't know I'd be doing with was, when I built this layout, was going as advanced as I would be. When I was putting the layout together, and this will go right into my points, I promise, bear with me, but when I was putting the layout together, I didn't want to have a symmetrical track plan. I wanted to have something that was kind of, not like spaghetti, but just went all over and kind of wasn't symmetrical, where some parts might have like a big turning radius and other bits might have switches on one side and maybe not a switch on the other side, or curves here and not there. And what I found with Fastrack is that when I would go to try to finish the loop that I would be working on, and whether this be both these loops, the upper loop and all that stuff, I found that the tracks themselves wouldn't like butt together. There would be sometimes, I don't know, 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inch gaps, and it'd be really annoying because I would have to get these little tiny track pieces, which I really wouldn't need because they're mostly meant for accessories. But I would have to get these little tiny track pieces and have to sometimes change around the whole configuration of my track loop just to get the whole thing to fit. Versus using something like Gargraves. I was about to say Ross custom switches, but those can go fine with Gargraves. But using something like Gargraves, where you have like a flexible track, I do know they make fixed track pieces, but talking about Gargraves Flex-track, I'm not sure what they title it, but it is a flexible track system. It's nice because you can cut the track wherever you'd like, you can bend it, you can curve it to your heart's desire, and you wouldn't have to have necessarily those little pieces. Now, unless if you're putting in accessories, maybe with like an insulated rail or signals or switches, maybe you might have to have little sections or change the track plan a little bit. But generally speaking, if there was a flexible track system, even that's longer than those very large Fastrack pieces that Lionel sells, you wouldn't have to deal with all these tiny little pieces that really get annoying because you'd be so close to done, but you'd be missing that little gap that just completes the whole, or that would have completed the whole layout. And this kind of goes into my next point, is that trying to go into freelance, very professional, I wouldn't say prototypical, because when you have as tight curves as I do on this thing, that's far from prototypical. But when you really want to have a freelance kind of no limits or anything like that track plan, Fastrack can actually be pretty limiting. Although it can help you in your head piece together what's gonna go where and all that stuff, I found that not being able to really cut the Fastrack wherever you like, or being limited as to how many screws you can put in, because on this track here there's only 2 spots to put in a screw, and underneath there's only these 2 points that you can really put in those little wiring sockets. I'm sure if you're real, like, you know your electronics and stuff like that well, I'm sure you could tack directly onto the rails underneath here. And I know you can remove these, I believe, for insulation, but really having these as the only 2 points for adding accessories, I believe, it's limiting. You can't have as long a piece or as big or narrow a curve as you want without having to buy pre-made track pieces. That'll be the thing. When I do go to my next train layout, I will be leaving the Fastrack behind, and I probably will move to Gargraves, something where, again, I have a lot more freedom with the track. I could go underneath the track and wire wherever I want, or solder the wires to wherever I'd like. I could make the curves as shallow or as tight as I want to. I can have as long straight sections as I want to, and still Gargraves can butt up to itself just fine. And I've never had any experience with Ross custom switches, but from what I've seen at train shows, they make some fantastic looking switches that can be actually really like very shallow, or again very tight too. It's kind of diverse there. So although, again, like I said earlier, Fastrack looks and functions fine for me, it can be very limiting. And I think that's that. I mean, I don't really have any other complaints I can think about Fastrack. I've had a very good experience compared to other O-scale model railroaders, but I think, again, it looks fine, it functions fine, it's really snug. Although the switches I don't like that much, I still like them better than O-gauge, old post-war switches and that stuff. But besides the switches and just the general limitations Fastrack might have, if you really want to go no limits or anything like that with making your train layout and really be a free prototypical scale freelancer, whatever, I really like Fastrack. And what I really like about it is how common it is too. You can go to any train show or most hobby stores, or especially online, and someone's bound to have Fastrack. And then it really isn't that expensive if you know where to look. I would preferably, if you're kind of on a tight budget, try to find used Fastrack or lightly used Fastrack, because it'll be a lot cheaper than the new stuff, of course. But even if you are, though, on a tighter budget, there are alternatives out there to Fastrack. Tubular track would, of course, be a good one, especially Menard's tubular track. I can't exactly remember the figure off the top of my head, but I know it's actually really cheap and affordable. So if you are in a thin budget, stuff like that might be the better way to go. When this comes to what do I recommend, then I would say if you're a beginner or if you're looking to have a relatively simple train layout with not many switches and stuff like that, I would say go for Fastrack. It looks great, it's readily available, it'll function fine for you, hopefully, fingers crossed and all that stuff. But I think for a beginner or just the intermediate O-scaler where you're not going to have a very big layout such as mine, or where you're going to have a very asymmetrical, really bizarre track plan that might not line up, if you're going simple, symmetrical, and just beginner or having a simple layout where you might screw down the track, you might not, but not go that complex with the scenery and stuff where you're doing everything permanently like I have, I'd say go Fastrack. But if you're going to have an advanced layout like mine, not necessarily from a wiring perspective, but from a scenery perspective and from a screwing everything down perspective, I would say it's probably best to find a different track alternative, because if you're gonna have those odd yards maybe, or just a track plan that's not the same on one side of the layout that might be on the other side, I'd say find something different. And I'm most likely going to go with guardrails on my next layout, because just like I mentioned earlier, I can reach any point of the tracks underneath to wire, or I could make the curves as slim or as sharp as I want to and have really long pieces. And I just think guardrails looks better than Fastrack when you're going to a super professional thing. But when you cover though Fastrack over with mine like I do ballast, I think it looks fine though, and I really don't again have many complaints. But if you're a beginner, I'd say go with Fastrack. If you have the money, of course. If you don't, try finding tubular track. But if you're going to have an advanced layout where you're gonna have a lot of switches, you're gonna have a lot of different things going on, and things might not line up, so to say, I'd go with guardrails. Or at least that's my personal thing. But what do you think? Was I right? Was I wrong? Do you have any experience with Fastrack you would like to comment on? Well, please write me a comment down below in the comment section. I would like to hear what you have to say, and I'm sure if there are many beginners who might watch this video, then I'm sure they'd be interested to hear what you have to say as well, because if you're always looking for opinions on stuff, seek multiple opinions, not just one, to determine what you do. But yeah, I think that's that. I hope you all enjoyed watching today's video. Again, I wanted to do this one for a little while, so yeah, again, thank you all for watching. If you liked the video, make sure to smash that like button, and again, if you're new to the channel, make sure to hit that red subscribe button down below. But anyways though, thank you all for watching. I will see you all in the next video / live stream / whatever I do, so stay tuned and bye bye.